people and wildlife have been drawn to this mountain oasis for hundreds of years because of the springs above us. Carlito Springs has been called one of the most amazing landscapes in the Southwest and unique because of its slope. From the natural spring at the top to the orchards with hundreds of fruit trees cascading below, elevation drops 750 feet. A terraced cluster of cabins, main house, and ponds sits between the spring and orchards, and all this is situated right above Route 66. Carlito Springs is a jewel. I'm going to talk to you today mostly, though, about Carl McGee. The title of this talk, in fact, could be The Trials of Carl McGee. His legacy contributed much to what's now Carlito Springs, but he's also of significance historically, both to New Mexico and the state. But first, a little background. This thing seems high. Can you still hear me? Okay. The land above us was originally settled by a Civil War veteran named Horace Greenwood Whitcomb. He discovered this spot while prospecting for gold in the hills of Tijeras and decided he'd like to live here. By 1882, he was doing just that, living in a tent, cultivating the land, building irrigation channels. Eventually, he built and operated a popular resort called Whitcomb Camp or Camp Whitcomb. He was already 62, but he proceeded to build 6 dwellings, a stable, 1.5 miles of pole fence, and nearly 1 mile of graded road. He planted 30 fruit trees and 80 grapevines. He raised horses and chickens. His 2-acre garden annually produced 15 bushels of corn and sufficient vegetables for his own use. Now, we know this because that's what he wrote in his 1891 application to buy an additional 80 acres under what was called the Preemption Act. And on that form, he wrote that all this improvement he had done over 9 years had a value of $2,000. The date 1895 can still be seen etched over a window up at the stone cabin up at Carlito, and that's part of Whitcomb's legacy. 2 years after he bought the 80 acres, he posted notice of intent to divorce his wife Ellen in the Albuquerque Daily Citizen. And that notice said, Ellen, quote, resides in Massachusetts and for 13 years has objected to making New Mexico her home. So all this time at Whitcomb Spring he was married, but essentially he was batching it. And 3 years after divorcing Ellen, he took another bride at a June wedding right here, performed right here at Camp Whitcomb in front of 30 city folk. The couple stayed on at Whitcomb Camp, but just 2 years later in 1898, Whitcomb turned the management of the camp to someone else. He sold the place in 1901, and in 1903 he died in California. So that 1901 sale was to a Mrs. Jessie Kelleher, and she's the one who'd been running the camp since 1898. And she changed its name from Camp Whitcomb to Whitcomb Springs. Now that's what it says. I don't know if you all can see this, but this is a blow-up of a postcard that was postmarked 1912, and it says Whitcomb Springs on it. And maybe after the talk, you all can come down and look at these pictures. But her sons, Tom and Jesse, for 5 years drove to town on a stagecoach drawn by 6 horses, picking up patrons and bringing them up here to Whitcomb Springs for cool mountain air, rest, and sightseeing. And Tom once told in an interview he made 550 stagecoach trips in those years. After Jesse Kelleher's death, there were at least nine owners that followed, and at least part of the time, it's believed Whitcomb Springs was used as a sanatorium. From 1926 to 1930, it was owned by the Knights of Pythias Sanatorium Association, and the cabins up there had screened-in porches, so they were certainly suitable for that use. So now we get to Carl McGee. I don't know if you can see these. Here's Carl. This promise of health is what brought Carlton Cole McGee to New Mexico from Oklahoma in 1919. He actually was in Albuquerque 10 years before he bought Whitcomb Springs for his wife Grace, who had TB and needed a higher and drier climate. And there used to be, some of you might remember, it's down at the county offices now, there used to be a little sign up here over a bridge that said Grace Bridge. That was his wife. McGee also changed the name from Whitcomb Springs to Carlito Springs in honor of his son, Carl Jr., who had died in 1925 in an airplane crash while training to be a military flyer. The stories that I'm about to tell you now that illustrate McGee's importance in history actually took place between the time McGee arrived in New Mexico and when he bought Carlito Springs. But it's an interesting story. Both a lawyer and journalist by profession, McGee was known in Oklahoma as a crusading newspaper editor and civic leader. Once he got to New Mexico, he immediately started publishing a paper called McGee's Independent. But within a year, he had bought the state's largest daily, the Albuquerque Journal. McGee's articles and editorials riled a lot of feathers. He relished going after what he saw as corruption. His articles criticizing the state land office provoked the ire of Albert Bacon Fall, powerful New Mexican, who considered the state land office his personal domain. Fall had served in both houses of the territorial legislature, was on the Supreme Court, he was an attorney general, and he was now one of the state's first U.S. senators. He resented McGee's scrutiny, and in retaliation and in hopes of heading off future articles, the powerful senator convinced a bank in Kansas City to call the loan McGee had on the Journal. And when that loan was called, First National Bank of Albuquerque pulled its smaller loan. Now, he appealed to his readers, and with the help of donations, McGee scraped by and published a few more months, but by June of 1922, he had lost ownership of the Journal. McGee wasn't one to roll over, however. He then founded and became editor of the New Mexico State Tribune, which was the forerunner of the Albuquerque Tribune, which I'm sure you all remember. He continued writing scathing editorials, scrutinizing Albert Fall's financial dealings as U.S. Interior Secretary in the national naval oil lease controversy known as the Teapot Dome scandal. McGee even testified against Fall in Washington. But Fall wasn't the only public figure scrutinized by McGee. He also wrote a lot about San Miguel County and what he called the copper-riveted political machine of Secundino Romero. He was a San Miguel County marshal who McGee alleged ran that part of the state by delivering the votes of San Miguel, Mora, and Guadalupe counties to the Republican Party. In his editorials, McGee continuously referred to San Miguel County as Sec Romero's empire, and he called District Judge David Leahy Romero's right-hand man. This is Judge Leahy. Okay, Judge Leahy was presiding judge in San Miguel County for 13 years, and he was furious about these articles that McGee was writing. He decided to charge McGee with libel. But he saw his chance when McGee wrote an editorial saying that the state Supreme Court clerk had been keeping funds a little too long before depositing them, and that Chief Justice Frank Parker should have noticed. So, to be clear about this, McGee is in Albuquerque. The Chief Justice he wrote about, Judge Justice Parker, is in Santa Fe. And Judge Leahy, up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, signed a warrant charging criminal libel against Parker. And he ordered a sheriff's deputy to come to Albuquerque, and the deputy came and arrested McGee and immediately took him by train to the San Miguel County Jail. McGee didn't even have time to assemble a legal team. He was over there. He did gather a stellar team of attorneys to his defense, but over the next several months he spent a lot of time in that jail. first fighting the libel claim, and then fighting what eventually totaled 11 contempt citations from Leahy's court. As his lawyers quickly realized, libel was just the first step. It was a ploy to get McGee into Leahy's court so he could find him in contempt. Even if he had just appealed just the cost of appealing each contempt charge was $1,000 a pop. In the first trial in Las Vegas, it was clear that Justice Parker didn't feel libeled by McGee. He never even heard of the article until the indictment was filed. People all over the state started talking about how McGee was being treated by San Miguel County, and they knew what was going on because McGee continued to write editorials from jail. As the libel case was about to go to the jury, prosecutor called McGee's article one of the, quote, most dastardly ever published in New Mexico. Leahy gave the jury its instructions and they found him guilty. And from the bench, Leahy sentenced McGee to 1 year in jail. But Governor James Hinkle immediately pardoned McGee and sent the pardon by airplane to Las Vegas, calling the whole proceeding a blot on New Mexico. That didn't deter Judge Leahy, because even before the trial had ended, he had filed papers charging McGee with contempt, some for the editorials from jail. One of the most damning of these contemptuous editorials was headlined, "Who is on trial?" And it made it clear that it was really Leahy and his court and San Miguel County that was on trial. And at this point, I should mention that the San Miguel District Attorney, Luis Armijo, refused to participate in this prosecution. Leahy had brought in a special counsel to do that. Decades later, Armijo said that Sec Romero, the real muscle behind this copper-riveted machine, was what Armijo called the most ruthless man he ever knew. But Romero never showed up in court. He left Leahy left alone to deal with what he had started. After the first 4 charges of contempt, jury found McGee guilty, and Leahy sentenced him to 360 days in jail and fined his McGee Publishing Company more than $4,000. And again, Governor Hinkle issued a pardon. And now, let me tell you about McGee's lawyers. His team of lawyers included former Supreme Court Justice Richard Hanna, Fred Wilson, who later became an attorney general, Las Vegas attorney George Hunker, who was chairman of the Democratic State Committee, Hunker's partner, M.E. Noble, who was a Supreme Court justice later, and Dennis Chavez, future U.S. Senator. This is his legal team. But in Leahy's court, even these lawyers were being found in contempt. So, in July of 1924, when McGee again was in trial, the lawyers decided to remain silent. They didn't say a word, and McGee only spoke 23 words, and this was after the judge directly asked him a question. Leahy found McGee guilty of contempt and asked McGee if he had anything to say before judgment and sentence was imposed, and McGee's reply was, "Only that I deny I am being accorded due process of law, and I deny that this is a court." So Lee, of course, was furious. He ruled McGee's statement direct contempt and immediately sentenced him to 3 months. And he had displayed fits of rage in court before, and this time he delivered what one reporter called, quote, "a tirade unequaled in violence by anything ever heard in a New Mexico court." Leahy even mentioned the Ku Klux Klan in this string of invectives, and in today's vernacular, he lost it. Governor Hinkle issued another pardon, but McGee remained in jail one night because Leahy refused to release McGee on appeal. Sheriff Lorenzo Delgado, who had let McGee write his editorials from jail, deputized 24 men to guard McGee against a mob that was demanding McGee's release. The commander of the National Guard had to be called in to convince them to disperse. The next morning, Sheriff Delgado accompanied McGee to Santa Fe, where the Supreme Court ruled that the governor did indeed have the power to pardon a conviction of direct contempt. At this point, it was clear Leahy was finished as a judge. I'm thinking I wanted to show you this, if you can see it. This is the 1885 Victorian courthouse where these trials were taking place, and the jail is right behind it. So in the 1924 election, Judge Leahy was replaced by Luis Armijo. This was the district attorney who had refused to participate in the prosecution. Sec Romero was also finished. He was replaced by Sheriff Delgado, who reorganized the Republican Party into something called Democratic Republicans. But that wasn't the end of McGee's Las Vegas trials. More than a year later, but it was on August 9th, 1925, which was last Saturday, 89 years ago. McGee was in Las Vegas being interviewed by a reporter for the Las Vegas Optic because McGee was chairman of the state hospital board. When Leahy and another guy walked by the hotel, and Leahy's companions noticed and said, "Hey, McGee's in there." Once again, Leahy lost it. He entered the lobby, ordered McGee to put up his hands and fight, started beating and kicking McGee. Leahy was physically a big man, but McGee had started carrying a gun whenever he came to Las Vegas, probably anticipating this day. And while on the floor being stomped by Leahy, he got off 3 shots. 2 shots went in Leahy's arm. The other hit John Lasseter, a young bystander who was trying to pull Leahy off McGee, and John Lasseter died. Those of you who have been to El Fidel Hotel in Las Vegas can imagine this scene because the lobby looks just like it did back when it was called the Meadows Hotel. It's the same hotel. For Lasseter's death, McGee was charged with murder. By the time of trial in June 26, it was reduced to manslaughter. Again, he was in San Miguel County Court, and he was in this courtroom. But this time the presiding judge was Luis Armijo. And when called as a witness, former Judge Leahy admitted instigating the beating, claiming he was justified because he felt threatened by the wording of one of McGee's editorials, and this was the first time he'd seen him since he'd left the bench. On hearing this, Judge Armijo accepted the defense motion for a verdict of acquittal. And in an unusual move, the jury sent the judge a note saying they would have reached the same decision. This photograph was taken just moments after the directed verdict. It's historic on several levels. It's got Judge Armijo in it on the left, and below him with the white beard is Elijah Long, who was a former Supreme Court justice. To the right of Long is Fred Wilson. Behind him is former Supreme Court Justice Hannah. The gentlemen of the jury are over here. If you could see this when we're done. But in the center of this picture, right here, you can't see it. It's Carl McGee, just acquitted. He's leaning back, confident. He has a cigar in his hand. Judge Armijo, who is the grandfather of Christina Armijo, who's a federal court judge in Albuquerque now, recognized how historic this moment was because he allowed, cameras were not allowed in the courtroom, but he allowed this picture to be taken. And this is also the only photograph I know that shows the interior of this beautiful 1885 Victorian courtroom. Okay, now we're back to Carlito Springs. 4 years later, he was here. It not only helped his wife, Grace, I think it probably brought some peace to Carl McGee. In 1932, the Journal ran an article describing what an oasis it was. The main residence included a dining room with fireplace and tea room big enough for 90 guests. You could dine al fresco under wild grapevines. Gardens were bursting with flowers, surrounded by box elder, juniper, cactus gardens. There were 2,000 trout in deep sunken rock terrace pools. McGee's granddaughter, Janelle Willingham, told me they fed the trout breadcrumbs, horse meat, and beans. They also raised watercress in the ponds for salads. And that year at Carlito, McGee continued to make history because he applied for and got a patent for inventing here's my last picture, the world's first parking meter. You can imagine that put him in good stead. But he didn't have to worry about day-to-day operations. He had partners at Carlito, Dr. and Cora Mae Meacham, and they ran the place. He eventually returned to Oklahoma, where he died in January 46. Mrs. Meacham died that same year, and so in 46, McGee's daughter Gertrude inherited Carlito Springs, lived here with her husband, Sandia Lab scientist Tony Grinko. Tony's the one who planted 250,000 tulip bulbs along the mountain paths. He added all kinds of trees, black walnut, nectarines, cherries, wild plums. And Janelle said every once in a while there'd be an apple as big as a pie itself. They were master gardeners. They won numerous state fair ribbons. And in 52, they bought 92 more acres, expanding this property to 172, which is almost the entire open space. And they ran the resort until 58, lived here till 96. And when they died, Tony was 92, and Gertrude, daughter of Grace and Carl McGee, was 93. That's the story of Carl McGee.